Hello. Welcome back to this devlog of mine. This one's going to be a little different. Back in May of 2021, I had released my first game, The Companion. Now it's been 3.5 years, and it's surpassed 100,000 in gross revenue. So here I'm going to break it down and go through some of the numbers. A small recap on the game. At its core, it's a story-driven walking simulator. It takes place in a beautiful-looking open world, and it has a couple extra mechanics thrown in. Nothing too taxing for the player. It took me 10 months to develop, and I released it on Steam in May of 2021. Then later I had ported it to the Switch, released it on GOG and EGS, and it's also selling on a couple other stores for PC. So we're going to get right into it here. This is how the game performed over the past 3.5 years. Started off pretty slow. It did cross the $1,000 mark relatively quickly, and it got 10 reviews in a week or so. So for a first release, those are positive signs. And there was some buzz with the game. I was being contacted by various people, publishers, etc. And eventually, I did land a publisher to help port it to the Nintendo Switch. So this giant increase here is when it released on the Switch. And that happened about 2 years after it came out on the PC. That was a very positive move for this game. And I think what attracted publishers to my game was mainly the visuals. Because I admit it's a walking simulator. There's not too much gameplay, but it has great visuals, great music. The story is decent. I admit there are some flaws with the story, but it is okay. This is the gross revenue over time. So first 2 years on PC only. It's above the average for a Steam release. They say, most games don't even make $1,000. It's about to cross the 40,000 units sold. I am thrilled with that. It's fantastic that people are buying and playing the game. It's a short game. It takes, at the quickest, you can finish it in 4 hours, but I would say average play time is about 6 hours. And this is the units over the last 3.5 years. So before it went to console, the first 2 years it sold just over 4,000 units. And the units really jumped up in 2022 because it started going on sale for much steeper pricing. I believe 2022, around November, the seasonal sales, I started putting it on like a 90% discount. So units really jumped up. Revenue did not jump as high. If I go back a couple slides, you can see revenue is actually down in 2022. But for me, I'm just happy people are playing the game. A 90% discount would be $1. It's selling for $9.99 by default right now. It actually released at $14.99, and after 1 year, I reduced it to $9.99. The pricing on the Switch is actually set by the publisher, so there the pricing is a little higher, and it does go on sale on the Switch as well. I think it's been as low as like around $5, but I don't have much control over that one. So moving on, this is where it gets a little more detailed, and I'll show what's ended up in my pocket, basically. Gross revenue through December of 2024 is 106,000. Gross revenue is just total sales before any deductions at all. Net revenue after all of the deductions is 40,000. So that's a giant cut. A lot of that goes to the platforms. Most of them take 30%. So there's some refunds and chargebacks, sales tax. Like I said, most of it is platform fees, publisher fees. So this is what's left over after all of that. This is around the cost to develop this game. I was on a strict budget. I spent less than this originally. When it released on Steam, my cost was around $6,000. Part of that was a revenue share with my composer. So I didn't take a salary. I don't count any hourly wages in this cost. Localization was a huge expense. That was the biggest expense, actually. For the most part, I feel it was worth it. Some languages might not have been worth it, but they were also the languages that did not cost as much. As I said, I did do a revenue share with my composer. I did also purchase sound assets and additional music for the game. Voice acting was a bigger cost as well, probably $1,500. There were only 4 characters in the game with speaking roles, and I had a narrator, so 5 speaking roles. I tried to keep it as minimal as possible. Voice acting can get quite expensive. The script was also, it was 60 pages in script form. In the film industry, 1 page is supposed to be like a minute of film time. If you use that metric, it's about an hour of voice acting, which I think is about right. There were some marketplace assets purchased, nothing substantial. Software subscriptions do add up. I use the Adobe software suite, and they like to charge an arm and a leg for everything. That's a big one. And then there's the minimal store fees, which you do get back eventually. And then my annual costs. Because I am continuing to work on future projects, I do have continual costs every year, which are the software subscriptions and so on. This $8,400 is about the costs I've spent over the past 3+ years just to show running a business is not free. There are costs. I'm spending probably around $2,500 a year to keep this business running. If I was to stop it all after this first release, that's another $8,400 I would have in my pocket. Other than software subscriptions, there's the annual reports you have to do. I have to get a business certification because my publisher is foreign. I have to get a certification so that I don't have to pay the taxes in the other country, tax prep fees. There are some marketing costs. I had attempted some ads online. I do not really run ads since the first year of the game's release. I gave it a test and it did not last too long. And I am spending money on AWS for my Perforce backup. I feel more comfortable it being on their servers rather than my own. In case anything happens, I'll be able to continue developing my game. So over the past 3.5 years, that's roughly my profit, just over 20 grand. Then the government takes their share, which this is an estimate. It's not an exact figure. Government's going to take about 30%. I'm left with about 15 grand. On a annual basis, I'm pocketing about $5,000, which is certainly helpful. So that's the financial end of, my first game. I'm going to dive into a couple other statistics here that might be interesting to somebody. Let's move on to wishlists. Before I entered the game into Steamfest, I had acquired 678 wishlists. This is over the course of about 6 months. I put it in Steamfest in February of 2021, and after Steamfest, I had 4,700 and something wishlists. I gained a substantial number of wishlists at Steamfest, over 4,000. The game was visually interesting. An image of it was in their Steamfest trailer that was on YouTube. It was visible on the front page of the open world section for Steamfest, and it may have made the main section of Steamfest. This was the first time I had ever put it in a Steamfest. I didn't really know much of what to do. Steamfest was still relatively new at the time as well. I just pretty much entered it into the Steamfest and let it run, and it did pretty well. Nowadays, the competition is much higher. It may not do as well if I was to have released it in a more recent Steamfest. 3 months later, I released the game. I feel like this is what you're supposed to do. When you get that injection of wish lists, you get that buzz, you do want to release it relatively soon after. You want to ride that wave. But as you saw from my numbers, It did not take off super well. I only sold under 1,000 units in the first year. At release, wishlist still kept climbing up to over 6,000, and that's what I released with. Nowadays, several years later, the common thread is to release with minimum 7,500 wishlist if you want any chance of success. Personally, I would even say higher than that, 10 to 15,000 minimum to have a shot. The competition's just so much higher these days. 1 month after, wishlists kept climbing to just under 9,000. And now today, January of 2025, there are still over 10,000 wishlists that, every time it goes on sale, a couple hundred of them will purchase, another couple hundred will delete it off their list, and it will also gain a couple hundred. So it's been remaining steady of over 10,000 wish lists for quite a while. In all, in total, since the beginning of time when this was added to Steam to now, it's added 22,000 wish lists have been added, 6,000 something deletes, and the purchases and gifts combined, it's like 5,300 purchases on Steam. So according to Steam, my conversion rate's 24.2%, which is above the average of 15.5%. So that's pretty good. A lot of that might have to do with the fact it's been on a 90% discount more than once. Usually once a year, I'll do the 90%. That leads to a lot of conversions. So I threw this chargeback and return number here. I don't know what the average is, but I believe 5% is a pretty good number. Again, this lower number could be the fact it's been on some steep discounts, so somebody's less likely to return a $1 game. This is what it looks like on Steam. So cross the 25,000 mark on Steam. Chargebacks, 5.3%. The 10,000 wish lists. So some stats on developing the game. I started it in August of 2020 and released it in May of 2021. My attempt was to work on this every single day. I typically started in the evenings into the early morning. 2 hours a day was bare minimum. I was often working on the game 3 to 4 hours every single day. And on weekends, I soaked a little more time into it on weekends. So bare minimum, 25 hours a week, but it was probably higher than that. I estimate I spent 1,000 hours. It's just a nice round number. Again, definitely more than 1,000. It's just hard to quantify. Then I did have like what I call miscellaneous hours. These are just time where I can go on my phone. When I was sitting at my computer, I wanted to use it as efficiently as possible. So anything I could do outside of that, I typically did. Might be like 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, whatever I could do to further the game. So this is script writing. That was a huge one. Asset creation on the phone. All of the ability icons, I just sketched them out on my phone. There was a lot of project coordination between voice actors, music. I did most of that just on the go. Research is a big one. So if I encountered a stopping point, a glitch, a bug, a problem I could not solve, I would move on to something easier that I could accomplish quicker, and I would research how to fix these issues when I basically only had a phone available. Then there was all the time it takes to set up the store and also marketing. I have a website for my business. Again, that's another business expense. That's part of, I guess, marketing. And, setting up the store on Steam takes a bit of time. These are things I typically did on my phone or, whenever I could. So definitely more than 1,000 hours were put into developing the game. The 1,000 hours is mainly the time, I say, when I was sitting behind a computer in Unreal Engine actually programming the game. Using this 1,000 hours with the profit part of the equation, the hourly rate comes to about $30 an hour. This is pre-tax, excludes any of the miscellaneous time, and it excludes my annual business cost. If I was to release one game and call it quits, this is basically my hourly rate. So, moving on, these are the platforms the game is released on, and clearly the Switch is the biggest winner, the biggest help. It surpasses all others. But to go through them, Steam, you always want to get on Steam. It gets your game out there. Humble Bundle and Green Man Gaming. Overall, I would say there are some minimum values you need to hit before you can even be paid from these platforms. So in a lot of cases, it's not going to be worth it. They've contributed a small amount, but overall, it's not been very fruitful. GOG, it was about a year and a half or so ago when I put it on their platform. It's done very well. I'm happy it's on there. For the PC side of things, it's definitely contributed quite a bit. Not as much as Steam, but it's certainly been worth it. And I like their platform a lot. I'm glad it's on there. And then recently, in the fall of 2024, I put it on EGS, the Epic Game Store. What's nice is their commission is the lowest of all of the platforms. So that's very nice. And you do get some visibility. The sales have been good. I would say comparable with GOG. The problem with Epic Game Store is onboarding the game is super difficult. My biggest problem was the achievement side of things. I only have 10 achievements in my entire game, but because I have them on Steam and GOG, Epic requires you to also put them on their store. So getting these achievements set up and working was my biggest headache. Overall, it was just such a painful process. I do think now that it's done, I'm happy it's on there. It is selling for the holiday sales or whatever. I think I pocketed over $500. This is a game, it's been out for over 3 years, and that extra money definitely helps. It's worth it. It's just painful. And then Switch. So I think the Switch is good for my particular game, just the way it's stylized and more casual. I do have a publisher for the Switch, so the success is hard to measure. How much is it the game? How much is it the publisher? It's a tough call. I don't have good metrics on that one. So to wrap this up, I wanted to call out my next project real quick here and just go through a couple of my thoughts. I hope to complete it by next year, maybe 2027 at the latest. By the end of this year, I want to see a majority of the game done. Things I've learned from the first release, polish, lots and lots of polish. The companion, I didn't polish hardly anything. I was just building it and going on to the next thing. First and foremost, the goal was to release a game. So to release the game, I just wanted to finish it. I tried not to be inefficient with my time. So with this next game I'm polishing, I've already worked on things many times over. It's going to be a much more polished product. Performance, also another big one. The companion had some performance issues, never really optimized the game. My publisher optimized it for console. This next game, performance is a big one. I want to make sure it runs well for as many people as possible. Gameplay. This next game is similar in style, but will have more gameplay elements. It's not just going to be a simple walking simulator. Very similar in many ways, but with extra gameplay elements. And marketing, for the most part, I was pretty successful with how I marketed the companion since it got in front of publishers without me having to do any outreach. And I want to try to mimic as much of that success as possible. It is a little more difficult these days. Several years later, competition's higher. It's just much more difficult. You have to adapt to the current climate. So it's always going to be a continual learning process. There are still questions I'm asking myself. Do I want to self-publish again? And if I do, should I self-publish console as well? Platforms, I do want to put it back on the Switch. I'm even considering trying to put this on mobile, and maybe I'll experiment with PlayStation and Xbox or just PlayStation. Festivals, I was not at any in-person festivals with my first game. I didn't have time to research all that and do any festivals. I built the game in 10 months, and that's all I was focused on. This next game, maybe I can look into it. I'm not sure how beneficial it would be. I think the biggest benefit is if you're seeking a publisher, you probably put it in festivals. I think by answering the first question will depend, if I put it in festivals or not. And then competition's a big question mark because games released on Steam it's just been exploding. It's become super saturated. The goal is to stand apart from the majority. I think the style of my games do that. I'm standing out from the crowd a little bit. I appeal to a smaller audience, but that's really all you need to do to be successful is to appeal to an audience. I'm not trying to appeal to every single person out there. That's about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.